from 1976 to 1980, gold had been moving up. And so had the rate of price inflation. The Federal Reserve was pumping money into the economy on a rapid basis. The head of the Federal Reserve was an obscure figure that people had never heard of before, named G. William Miller. He had no real experience in monetary policy. He was officially in charge during the period, at least 18 months of the period prior to the Volcker nomination, which was in late '79. He gave no speeches that anybody paid any attention to. You had the second phase of the oil crisis in '79. The first was in '73. Prices went up. Next phase did it again in '79. Oil prices went up. Energy costs went up. All prices were going up because of the expansion of the money supply. Gold was skyrocketing. 1979, so was silver. Silver was approaching $50. Gold was approaching $800. There was a sense of crisis in terms of the economy. And at that point, in the fall of '79, Carter convinced Miller to resign to become Secretary of the Treasury, which was at that point a figurehead position, and he put Paul Volcker in as the head of the Fed. And Volcker, along with the other Fed members, decides this is a crisis. This is a major crisis. We've got to stop the expansion of money, and they did. And that meant they would have to stop the targeting of interest rates, and they did. And rates began to climb, and rates began really to climb because there was no Federal Reserve money coming in to hold down rates. And so long-term and short-term rates began to accelerate and continue to accelerate. Now, gold peaked at about $850 for one day in January of 1980, and then it began to fall. And that was because interest rates were getting so high. And it was pretty clear at that point there was going to be a recession. At least it was clear to me that there was going to be a recession. And so, as a result, Carter had a crisis politically, because you never want to run for re-election in the middle of a recession. That is the kiss of death. In that year, 1980, as the potential for a defeat of Carter becomes a real possibility now in people's thinking, an organization is formed called the Council for National Policy, CNP. I was part of the organization. It was basically put together by the combination of the New Right and the New Christian Right. And these were people generally with nonprofit organizations, but some were political experts. And they included the usual suspects: Paul Weyrich, Free Congress Foundation. I was in it at that time. So was Tim LaHaye. He was a major figure behind it. The money, a lot of the money at least, was coming from Rich DeVos, who was with the Amway organization, which was highly successful. There were other old-timers who'd been around for quite a while, some of them famous, some of them not so famous. But they were certainly, they had constituencies, they had mailing lists, they had operating organizations, which meant there was something of substance there in terms of the power of changing people's minds. There was a rally in the spring called the Washington for Jesus rally, and this was to pray for the country. They were concerned about the crisis in Iran because the American embassy had been invaded and everybody there had been arrested. They were in jail. So the Middle East looked unstable, and the country, the economy was looking terribly unstable. And so a lot of the figures of what later became the Christian right but was not yet the Christian right showed up at Washington. Pat Robertson was there. Bill Bright was there of Campus Crusade. Other Christian groups were represented there at this rally to pray for the country. Now, that was not explicitly a political rally. But in the fall, September, in Dallas, there was an express political rally. It was called the National Affairs Briefing Conference. And there's almost no record of this that anybody has. If you go on the web, if you look it up, I'm probably the biggest source of information on it. And at that rally, the organizers, who were Christian fundamentalists for the most part, put together a meeting, a gathering of the tribes, of the political activists and operators who would come together and train and motivate pastors, Christian laymen, other people who were concerned about the direction that the country was moving in. And so they brought out a lot of speakers, some of them big ones, some of them, in my case, smaller fry. And we all came at this arena, which would hold about 13,000 people, and we began to talk about the need for political change. And the organization invited the three candidates. Now, you forget that there were three candidates in '80, but there were. Carter was invited as the president. Reagan was invited. He had gotten the nomination. And John Anderson, the third-party candidate, was invited. And Carter did not accept it, and Anderson did not accept it, but Reagan accepted it. And the rumor was it was against the advice of his handlers that he did accept it, but he did. And so on the final night, Reagan spoke. He was preceded by one of the best speakers of the period, named James Robison. Robison has his own television show now, and for the last 30 years he's been known as a man with lots of helps ministry, and has a very low-key husband and wife television show where they interview people. You would not believe the extent to which this man was a true fire and brimstone preacher, one of the great evangelists I've ever heard. In front of a large crowd, there was almost nobody any better. And he introduced Reagan with a long speech. And what I remember about it, he said, "I warn you," he said, "the Christians must not wind up in the back pocket of the Republican Party." He said, "This is not a partisan issue." And he really believed that. He was afraid of winding up in anybody's back pocket. And then he introduced Reagan, and Reagan came on and gave this speech. It was a fairly Christian speech, a standard Reagan-type speech, but he made this statement. He said, "I know you cannot endorse me, but I endorse you." And that brought the crowd down. And that was symbolic of what was to happen just 2 months later. Reagan had a landslide victory over Carter, and it was not perceived that that would take place until just the last couple of months of the campaign. Now, Reagan was an evangelical. He attended, for a long period of time, he attended Bel Air Presbyterian Church, which was pastored by a man named Don Moomaw. And Moomaw had been an All-American football player at UCLA in the early 1950s, had gone to seminary and had come back, and his theology was generally conservative. And so he was preaching to Reagan all this time, and Reagan, as far as anybody inside knew, was a confessing Christian. And certainly in terms of a formal confession, he had to be, because he was taking the Lord's Supper, and there was no indication that he was not a member in good standing of the church, and the church was a conservative, a generally evangelical church. But he never talked much about it in public, which is an odd fact, but he didn't. And yet, in terms of his commitment, he was not just a conservative, but conservative in his theological views. And the conservative Christian fundamentalists in the hinterlands perceived it. And so they elected him. And it was perceived by the media at the time that there had to be an explanation for this. How in the world could this man do it just out of nowhere? Of course, it wasn't out of nowhere. He'd been two-term governor of California. But how did he do it? Well, they said it must have been the evangelicals. That must have been the swing vote. And there was a swing vote in favor of him. But whether it was enough to elect him, that's hard to say, because he had a major victory. But that was when, for the first time, the media began to concentrate on what is going on in the hinterlands with respect to church members becoming active in politics. Now, the social gospel liberals had been preaching at this point for almost 100 years that Christians have got to get active in politics. And what's the matter with Christians? They're staying out of politics. Christianity's got to move into politics. And all of a sudden, finally, it happens. For the first time, it happens, and Reagan is elected. They can't believe it. The liberals in the church cannot believe that this would happen. But it did happen. Now, what happened in '81 was predictable. That is, Reagan was pretty much controlled by his staff, and his staff was pretty much appointed by George H.W. Bush, who was the vice president, who had been pushed on Reagan, basically shoved down Reagan's throat in the summer of 1980. He had said he would not put Bush, who had run against, not put him on the ticket, but he did put him on the ticket. And someday I'll tell you the story of why. But one of the individuals is still alive who was involved in the pressure, and I'm not interested in a lawsuit, but I'll tell that story someday, because I got it from Cleon Skousen 20 years ago. Reagan had a recession. Carter had a recession, now Reagan had a recession. And it was inevitable, because the Federal Reserve had been pumping money in for all those years under Nixon and under Ford and under Carter, and all of a sudden the money stops getting pumped in, interest rates go up, and you have a recession. It's a formula for a recession, and Reagan got one. It was a bad one, '81 and '82, but he was still able to get through Congress what he really wanted, which was a reduction of marginal tax rates. And rates moved down from top rate of about 50% down to about 28%. And so you had, for the first time, you had at least an indication that there was not going to be excessive taxation. He broke the strike of the air traffic controllers. He wasn't expecting he would do it. He did do it. He broke them. That ended their ability to shut down the airlines. And he was out there. He loved his ranch, and he rode on horseback, and he chopped wood, and the man went out and he built his own fence. This was not fake. This was not a photo op. He loved that crummy little ranch. It was a big ranch, it was worth a lot of money, but the building is just, it's hardly more than a, it's not a shack, but it's certainly not what you'd call anything like a livable operation for anything like a large family. Just a small little building, and he loved it. And here he is on television. He's chopping wood. He's riding the horse whenever he can. You know who's watching this? The Soviet leaders are watching this. They're seeing a man apparently their own age out there. He busts the strike. He's articulate. He's getting the message across. He's chopping wood. He's riding horseback. These guys are barely able to walk. They're on walkers almost. And a friend of mine who's a great expert in political affairs, Angelo Codevilla, he said this was they watched to see what Reagan would do, and Reagan looked like he was going to be a winner. And they didn't know how to handle him. And they never did find out how to handle him. Soviet Union never did find out how to handle Reagan. He bankrupted him. So you began to see then this crisis of the economy subsiding in recession. In '82, the recession ended, and the growth began to take place again. Interest rates began to come down. Inflation rates were coming down. It looked as though the economy was going to recover. Now, Reagan did hike taxes on Social Security because literally, technically, in 1983, Social Security went bankrupt, just as it is really now. I mean, technically, it may not be bankrupt because of all the IOUs in the trust fund, but operationally, as of 2010, there's not enough money coming into the Social Security Trust Fund to fund it, to fund the obligations going out. And now it's being funded by the general fund. So basically, economically speaking, Social Security once again is bankrupt. But Reagan hiked taxes on Social Security, at least hiked the amount of wages that would be covered, and we're still under that. He gave his famous Star Wars speech, the speech about the Strategic Defense Initiative, about having an outer space defense against nuclear missiles. That scared the USSR because technologically it was possible to have that system, and they knew that, which would eliminate the threat of the first strike. And that was resisted by the liberals in one of those very strange phenomena. They didn't really understand what was at stake, because the country, both countries on both sides of the Iron Curtain, were in captivity. The civil population was each potentially targeted by nuclear strikes. It was called mutually assured destruction. And each side said, well, if you bomb us and kill 100 million of us, we'll be able to get our missiles off and kill 100 million of you. Civilians, you understand, not warfare between armies. It's that the civilian populations were being targeted as a part of strategic doctrine in the United States, and Reagan didn't want it. Reagan wanted a way to stop the threat of a first strike. And he was even willing, as he said, he was even willing to say, we'll give the same technology, we'll share the technology with the Soviets. We've got to stop the threat of a first strike, of some mistake leading to nuclear war. Made sense to me, but it never made sense to the liberals. They fought him, they ridiculed him. And yet, as a strategic move, it certainly was better than being under captivity and the threat of a missile strike in which the entire society is taken down by this enormous power of the missiles. So Reagan, he never gets it deployed, but at least he talks about it. And the Soviets are beginning to see that they've got a real problem, because they can't keep up with this economically, and they can't keep up with this technologically. And they're now by this point, they're 4 or 5 years into the quagmire of Afghanistan. They're losing. They can't hold it. They're finding what every empire always finds, going back to Alexander the Great, that you can't occupy Afghanistan's soil for very long. It's going to cost you too much in loss of life and loss of money. And the Soviets are beginning to figure this one out. And then what happens in the mid-'80s, Reagan does what he's been thinking about doing for 5 years. That is, he gets Stinger missiles to the Afghanistani troops. And it was thought, well, you can't train these troops to run a Stinger missile. And the first one that is fired brings down a Soviet plane. And the Soviets are faced with a problem, and that is they got to take the planes up to 15,000 feet to avoid the Stingers. And once they take the planes up, they can't defend the troops on the ground. They have to be at 5,000 feet, and they can't fly at 5,000 feet. And their whole strategic doctrine begins to collapse in Afghanistan. And it takes another 4 years to get them out, but that's what takes place. They're beginning to lose that war. Pat Robertson in 1988 runs for president, doesn't get anywhere, demits the ministry, but shows that he's at least talking about politics. Falwell's moral majority backs George Bush, and at that same year, 1988, Rush Limbaugh goes national on the radio. So we begin to see at this point, you've got satellite television, you've got radio is about to make a comeback, talk radio, which is basically Limbaugh radio. And as far as national figures, there's no major national political figure for the conservatives at this point by the late 80s. But certainly they're well organized, they've got money, they've got mailing lists, they've got all kinds of magazines, there are book publishing operations. This is not a small movement anymore. By the end of the 80s, this is not a small movement. They are in a position really to begin to affect policy if they get their act together, if they can get through in terms of having influence in the national parties. But they don't. They're locked out of the parties. They've been locked out of the parties, even though Reagan won. They have been locked out. That Reagan is his own man, he makes his own decisions, but he's not making decisions because of anything that conservatives are telling him. And of course, at the beginning of '89, he leaves office. In '89, two major events take place, and they don't take place inside the United States. Not our issue, directly. One is that the Berlin Wall goes down. The symbol of the split between East and West, the symbol of the ability of the Soviet Union to control its satellites, that symbol is torn down. And with that, it's clear that there's something fundamentally wrong inside the Kremlin. There's some lack of power. Something is going wrong. The series of leaders that took place in the early 80s, when Brezhnev is replaced by Chernenko, who doesn't last very long, and is replaced by Andropov, who immediately drops off. He's replaced by Gorbachev. Gorbachev seems like a new figure. Now Gorbachev came up through the KGB, so he's not really a new figure, but his rhetoric is different, and he does understand there's a crisis economically, and they can't solve it. And it is the basic crisis of socialism. They don't know what anything ought to cost. They don't know how to organize production. Their expenditures associated with the military is very high compared to the percentage of the American GDP. They're bankrupting themselves in terms of keeping this enormous military force, growing navy, and now this disaster in Afghanistan. All of this is working against the Soviet Union. And for a period of 10 years, you've begun to see in the satellite countries the beginning of resistance. The resistance is coming to some extent because of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church resistance is coming because John Paul II knows that he's not a communist, and he's got to stop the communists. He's been fighting communists virtually all of his life. He was a young man under the Nazi rule, and then he came to maturity under communist rule, and he was trained by a cardinal named Wyszynski, who knew how to beat the system, who knew how far to push the government, whether it was a Nazi-run government or a communist-run government. And he learned how to work within the system, and he was an anti-communist, but he had to be very judicious about it. But he was determined from 1980 onward that if he could make an assault indirectly against the Soviet control over Poland, he was going to do it, and he did do it. And the church began to organize, and people began to go back to church because they perceived that here was a man speaking on their behalf, a man from their country. And so you began to see the growth of the Solidarity movement inside Poland. And it was a labor union movement, but it was a Catholic Church movement. It was a social movement. It was the beginning of resistance against the Soviet control of Poland. And that idea began to spread in Eastern Europe. So country by country, you began to see the beginning of resistance. And Gorbachev finally decides in '89 not to send in the tanks. Now, in 1968, in Czechoslovakia, they'd sent in the tanks. And Dubček, who'd been the primary political figure, was just disappeared almost overnight. The tanks went through the streets. The Soviet Union was not going to back down in '68. But in 1989, it did. It let the Eastern European countries, which had been officially communist, collapse. They no longer attempted to stop the transformation of those countries into Western-style democracies. And it was at that point you knew that something fundamental had changed. Communist doctrine had fundamentally changed in terms of what they were willing to accept. And this had been not seen by almost anybody. There was one woman named Judy Shelton who back in '87 had written a book about the coming bankruptcy of the Soviet Union, but nobody really paid any attention to her. And yet within a year the crisis had begun. You had Solzhenitsyn in the West, who'd been translating the Gulag Archipelago, or not translating it, but writing it. It had been translated. He was able to mobilize Western opinion, and the samizdat literature began sneaking in his books and materials into the Eastern Bloc countries. They were falling apart. They were economically in a disaster zone. There had been a complete failure of communism in terms of an economic system. Now there was a complete failure of communism in terms of politics. So, by the end of the year, it really ceases. The USSR leaves Afghanistan. And it's over. The battle is over in terms of that region of the country. Afghanistan is abandoned. Soviets go back, cross the roads, take the tanks out, and retreat from the country. By the way, I've just said something. The Soviets took the tanks out of the roads and retreated. How do you get a Soviet tank down an Afghan road? Well, you don't. Unless you get the U.S. to help you. In the mid-1960s, we put up all the money to build highways from the edge of the Soviet Union down to Kabul. We put up the money, and the Soviets put up the technology, and the Afghans did the work, and it was virtually unknown. For years it was unknown. I was about the only person who ever talked about it through the whole period, and I only knew about it because I'd read an obscure article in an obscure engineering magazine about this amazing project in the mid-60s of building this highway. Well, it was the classic lure. It was, I think it was cheese on a trap. And the Soviets came down merrily invading like they were going to be able to keep the place in the late 70s. And by the late 80s, they retreat up those same highways to get the tanks out. Then the big event, of course, the next major event was the Gulf War. 1 month in February of 1981. There's no question that Iraq is a client state of the Soviet Union. It had been a client state of the United States less than a decade earlier, but now it was a client state of the Soviet Union using Soviet equipment, Soviet weapons. It's all taken out in hours. The whole Air Force is taken out. The tanks are taken out. The airplanes, the Soviet fighters are taken out of the sky before they even know that there is an American anywhere near them. So here you have a situation. The generals have been run out of Afghanistan, 79, 89, 1991, they have a war. All of their equipment is shown to be worthless. Didn't do them any good at all. By August, it's over. The Soviet Union collapses. The end of the Soviet Union. The Communist Party just shuts down. The Soviet leadership shuts down. They abandon Marxism-Leninism, which is just, it's the largest empire in the history of the world. No empire has ever fallen peacefully that fast and without warning. And they simply shut the thing down. Somebody needs to do a study of where did the Communist Party funds go? And I think where they went was into private bank accounts in Switzerland. I think that's where the money went. And I have a friend who I've encouraged to write the book about it because he knew some of the men who were involved in that monetary transfer. But that's following the money when it's Communist Party money and Swiss money is not as easy as it sounds. But the Communist Party shuts down. The Soviet Union is no more. Overnight, bloodless, not even a coup. I mean, it's there's no battle in the street. Nobody's shooting. They just simply resign. They give up. And in that same year, 1991, an obscure man works in Switzerland, scientist, a geek named Tim Berners-Lee, introduces a new communication system called, later, the World Wide Web. And that was to change everything over the next 15 years. We'll be talking about it in the next presentation.